The air in the conservatory was a living thing, thick with the scent of damp earth, night-blooming jasmine, and the subtle green perfume of decay. It was an atmosphere of managed wilderness, a place where life and its inevitable decline were allowed to coexist under a dome of plasteel that shimmered with the artificial twilight of the sector's regulated cycle. Elian traced the rim of a terracotta pot, his fingertip coming away with a smudge of cool soil. The texture was grounding, real, in a way that the polished chrome and recycled air of his former life had never been. Here, things grew. They also withered. There was a quiet honesty in that cycle, a truth he had been denied for most of his existence. He was not a component. He was not a genetic designation. Here, surrounded by the chaotic tangle of vine and leaf, he was simply Elian. A floorboard creaked behind him, a familiar sound that no longer startled him. It was Kale, his presence a steady, quiet weight in the room. He didn't speak, not immediately. He never did. Kale understood the delicate architecture of Elian's peace, how easily a sudden noise or an unexpected question could cause the whole fragile structure to tremble. Instead, he moved to the workbench, the soft rasp of him rolling up his sleeves, filling the space between them. Kyle was a horologist by trade, a mender of time, and his hands, usually stained with lubricant and specked with metallic dust, were surprisingly gentle as he picked up a miniature watering can. "The calathea is drooping," Kale said, his voice a low baritone, calm as a slow-moving river. "It dislikes the nutrient supplement from the central dispensary. Too much saline." Elian looked at the plant in question, its ornate leaves curled inward like fists. A pang of empathy, sharp and unwelcome, resonated in his chest. He knew what it was to be fed something that was supposed to sustain you, but only made you shrink. He had been told for years that the bond with an alpha, a designated alpha, was sustenance. He had been told that the sharp, metallic scent of Reese, the oppressive weight of his presence, the clinical precision of his touch, was a nutrient he should crave. Instead, it had leached the color from his world, leaving him curled and drooping, just like the plant. "I can filter some water from the atmospheric condenser," Elian offered, his own voice soft, still tentative even after 2 years in this sanctuary. "It will be purer." Kale nodded, his focus already shifting to the intricate guts of a chronometer laid out on a velvet cloth. Tiny gears and springs glittered like captured starlight under the focused beam of his work lamp. His concentration was absolute, a form of meditation. Watching him work was one of the things that had first soothed the frantic, screaming thing in Elian's mind. Kale's world was one of order, but it was an order he created himself, from a chaos of broken parts. He did not impose it. He discovered it, coaxing fractured pieces back into a harmonious whole. It was a stark contrast to the rigid, top-down order of the society that had produced and then discarded Elian. Elian retrieved the condenser flask and began the slow process of purification. The hum of the small machine was another layer in the conservatory's quiet symphony. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a habit learned from Kale. Haste was a symptom of panic, a remnant of a life spent anticipating the next evaluation, the next judgment. Here time was measured not by glowing digits on a wall panel, but by the unfurling of a new leaf, the slow turn of a gear, the gradual settling of dust on a forgotten shelf. He remembered a time when his every breath felt monitored, his heart rate a metric on a distant screen. Reese had called it optimization. The system called it stability. Elian now called it a cage. The conservatory was Kyle's inheritance, a forgotten pocket of the sector, grandfathered in from a time before the great restructuring, when private ownership of organic life was deemed inefficient. It was attached to his small workshop and living quarters, a relic of a more chaotic, more vibrant era. For Elian, it had become a chrysalis. He'd arrived 2 years ago, a husk, not broken, because that would imply there were pieces left to reassemble. He had been hollowed out, erased. His designation as an Omega, once the defining pillar of his identity, had been officially desynced from the Alpha Reese following the rejection. The official record stated bio-incompatibility. The truth was a colder, sharper thing that he kept locked away, a shard of ice in his heart that Kyle's quiet warmth had not yet managed to fully melt. Kyle never asked about it. He had found Elian through a mutual acquaintance, a discreet medic who dealt with the system's inconvenient human fallout. He'd offered Elian a room, a purpose, tending to the plants, a living library of species long extinct in the wild, and, most importantly, he had offered him silence. A silence that was not empty, but full of unspoken understanding. He was a beta, stable and unassuming, his scent a mild, pleasant mix of cedar and worn leather that asked for nothing and offered only calm. He existed outside the violent push and pull of the alpha-omega dynamic that had nearly destroyed Elian. He was safety. As the purified water dripped slowly into the collection beaker, Elian watched Kyle's hands. They moved with an impossible precision, tweezers placing a screw no larger than a grain of sand. There was no tremor, no hesitation. This was a man who understood how delicate things worked. He understood that pressure had to be applied with care, that true strength was not in force, but in patience. Reese's hands had been strong, but they had been tools of possession, his touch, an assessment, a claim. Kale's hands, when they occasionally brushed against Elian's, were just hands. Warm. Real. Elian finished with the water and carried the small can to the drooping calathea. He watered it slowly, watching the dry soil darken and drink. He felt a resonance with the thirsty plant, a sense of shared relief. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not the Omega who had failed his designated purpose. He was Elian, and in the quiet, green-scented air of a forgotten conservatory next to a man who mended time, he was slowly, carefully, learning to grow again. The past was a ghost, but its footsteps were growing fainter. The silence was no longer a void where screams had once been, but a space waiting to be filled with the sound of a leaf unfurling. It was a fragile piece, but it was his. He had earned it, and he would not let it go. The days bled into one another in a gentle watercolor wash of greens and browns, punctuated by the silver glint of Kale's tools and the soft gold of the artificial dawn. Elian learned the names of the plants, their needs, their silent languages. He learned that the fiddle-leaf fig demanded light but sulked if moved, that the maidenhair fern would crisp at the slightest hint of dry air, a delicate drama queen. He spoke to them sometimes, his voice a low whisper, sharing secrets with their leaves that he could not yet give to Kyle. They were better listeners, their judgment extending only to the quality of their water and the richness of their soil. They did not care about his genetic markers or his synaptic compatibility scores. They only cared if he was kind. Kyle, in turn, learned the rhythms of Elian, He learned that Elian was quietest in the mornings, that the scent of ozone from a passing sanitation drone could make his hands tremble, that he sometimes stared at his own reflection in the polished surfaces of the workshop as if seeing a stranger. Kale never commented on these things. Instead, he would simply make a cup of herbal tea, the steam carrying the scent of chamomile and lavender, and place it near Elian's elbow. It was a gesture of acknowledgement without intrusion, a quiet offering of support that was more profound than any words of comfort could ever be. Their relationship was a tapestry woven from such threads, a pattern of small, deliberate kindnesses. It was not the fiery, fated bond the scribes wrote about in the sanctioned romances, the one he was supposed to have with Reese. It was something quieter, deeper, something chosen. One evening, as the sector lights dimmed to a soft violet, Kale was working on a particularly stubborn timepiece, a relic from the pre-restructuring era. Its inner workings were a chaotic maze, unlike the streamlined, modular designs of modern chronometers. It required intuition, not just technical skill. Elian was sitting nearby, cleaning soil from under his fingernails with a small wooden pick, the repetitive motion soothing. "This one," Kale murmured, more to himself than to Elian. "It fights me. It has a memory of its own time. It doesn't want to conform to the new standard." He looked up, his grey eyes catching the low light. "Some things are like that. They have a history that can't be erased by a simple recalibration." The words hung in the air, freighted with an unspoken meaning that settled directly into Elian's chest. He stopped his cleaning, his hands suddenly still. A history that can't be erased. He thought of the biolabs, the sterile white rooms where he had been raised, conditioned, and prepared for his designation. He was a product, meticulously crafted for a purpose. His memories were not his own. They were a collection of training modules, scent imprinting sessions, and psychological conditioning programs designed to ensure a seamless bond with a high-tier alpha. And then there was Reese, his scent, a sharp, cold fragrance like winter air on metal, had been piped into his rooms for a year before they met. He was supposed to feel completion, a sense of coming home. He had only ever felt a profound and terrifying sense of being consumed. The rejection had been as clinical as their introduction. A small, white room. Reese, standing perfectly still, his face an impassive mask. A medtech with a data slate. No emotion, no anger, just a quiet statement. The synaptic resonance is unstable. Phenotypic markers show a latent volatility. The asset is compromised. Asset. Not alien. Not a person. An asset. The word had echoed in the silent space where his heart was supposed to be. He was faulty equipment being returned. The shame had been a physical force, pressing the air from his lungs. The desyncing procedure was quick, a painless injection that severed the nascent bond. But it had felt like an amputation. They had cut away the part of him that was supposed to make him whole, and then they had told him it was his own fault for being defective. "Elian?" Kyle's voice was soft, pulling him from the cold memory. Elian blinked, the conservatory coming back into focus. The warm, humid air felt like a blanket. He realized he was holding his breath. He let it out in a shaky sigh. "Sometimes," he said, the words feeling rough and unused, "recalibration isn't the answer. Sometimes the thing just needs to be allowed to run on its own time." A rare, small smile touched Kyle's lips. He set down his loop. Exactly. He reached out, not to touch Elian, but to tap the terracotta pot beside him. You can't force a seed to sprout faster than its nature allows. You can only give it the right conditions to grow. The right conditions. Warmth, patience, safety. Elian looked at Kyle, at the man who had given him a place to put down roots without ever asking what poisoned the soil of his past. He felt a surge of emotion so potent it almost frightened him. It was not the desperate, pre-programmed need he had been taught to identify as love. It was gratitude, a quiet, solid thing. It was affection, born of shared silences and mutual respect. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before lightly touching the back of Kyle's hand where it rested on the workbench. Kyle's skin was warm, calloused, real. Kyle's hand turned over, his fingers gently closing around Elian's. He didn't squeeze, didn't pull. He just held, a simple, declarative statement of presence. I am here. You are not alone. In that moment, the shard of ice in Elian's chest seemed to shrink, just a little. A single drop of water melting from its frozen surface. It was a beginning. The silence that followed was different. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a connection so deep it had no need for words. The stubborn old timepiece on the workbench ticked softly, finding its own rhythm in the quiet hum of the conservatory. It was a sound of gentle defiance, a promise that even broken things, in the right hands, could learn to mark time again. Elian closed his eyes, focusing on the feeling of Kyle's hand around his, the scent of jasmine and damp earth, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he did not feel like a ghost. He felt anchored. The chime was an alien sound in their world of organic hums and mechanical clicks. It was the crisp, sterile tone of an official communication, a sound Elian had not heard in 2 years, a sound he had prayed he would never hear again. It emanated from the small, sleek panel by the workshop's entrance, a concession to the sector's networked grid that Kyle was required to maintain. Both men froze. Kyle's hand, which had been adjusting the tension on a hairspring, went perfectly still. Elian, who was misting the ferns, felt the plastic bottle slip from his nerveless fingers and clatter to the stone floor. The sound was obscenely loud in the sudden, absolute silence. Kyle was the first to move. He placed his tools down with his usual deliberate care, but Elian saw the tightness in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. He walked to the panel, his footsteps measured, even. He placed his thumb on the scanner, and the panel lit up, projecting a column of cold, blue light into the warm, green air of the conservatory. A message hovered there, composed of sharp, clinical script. Communication. Pending. Rice Valerius, Tier Alpha, Sector 7. Subject. Asset Reclamation Protocol. 7.3. Awaiting acknowledgement. The words were knives. Asset. Reclamation. They stripped away the 2 years of healing, the carefully constructed identity, and left him exposed. A thing to be claimed. A piece of property that had been misplaced and was now being sought. Elian's breath hitched, a painful tearing sound in his throat. The scent of ozone, sharp and sterile, seemed to fill the air, a phantom of the labs, of Reese. He could feel the cold floor of the rejection room under his bare feet, see the dispassionate light of the medical scanner. The world tilted, the lush green of the conservatory blurring at the edges, replaced by a stark, unforgiving white. Elian. Kyle's voice cut through the rising panic. He had not turned around, but his voice was a lifeline. Breathe. Elian tried to obey. He dragged in a ragged gulp of air that tasted of metal and fear. His hands were trembling violently. He wrapped his arms around himself, a futile attempt to hold his fracturing self together. "It's just a message," Kyle said, his back still to him, his body a solid shield between Elian and the glowing text. "It has no power here." But it did. They both knew it. The protocols were law. A tier alpha's claim, especially one with Reese's standing, carried the full weight of the authority. A rejection could be rescinded under certain circumstances. If new data emerged, if the alpha's own status was jeopardized by the lack of a bonded Omega. It was rare, but it was possible. And the word reclamation was unambiguous. It was not a request, it was a statement of intent. Kale's thumb hovered over the acknowledge icon. He was hesitating. Acknowledging it would begin a process, a chain of events that could not be easily stopped. Ignoring it was not an option. That would trigger an automated enforcement dispatch. He finally pressed it, his movements firm. The message dissolved and was replaced by a new one. Physical presence requested. ETA, 17 standard minutes. 17 minutes. The number was an executioner's countdown. 17 minutes until the ghost that haunted his every waking moment would walk through their door. 17 minutes until the sterile, controlled world he had fled would stand on their threshold. "No," Elian whispered, the word a tiny, broken thing. "No, he can't. He has no right." Kyle finally turned, and the calm control he usually wore had cracked. In his eyes, Elian saw a reflection of his own fear, but it was alloyed with something else, a hard, protective anger. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides and gripped Elian's shoulders. His hold was firm, grounding. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You are not an asset. You are not his. This place is yours as much as it is mine. He has no power over you anymore." Elian wanted to believe him, desperately. But the conditioning ran deep, a network of poisoned roots still anchored in his soul. The alpha's call, the societal imperative, the ingrained sense of his own worthlessness post-rejection. It all came rushing back, a tidal wave of remembered trauma. He started to shake his head, a frantic, negative motion. "You don't understand. He is Reese. The authority will listen to him. They will see his data, his status, and they will see me. A desynced, flawed Omega living with a beta. They will see a malfunction that needs to be corrected." "Let them," Kyle said, his voice dropping even lower, fierce and absolute. "Let them try." The countdown continued in the silent chambers of Elian's mind. Each tick of the old chronometers on the wall was a second lost. He could already smell it. Reese's scent, that impossibly cold fragrance, cutting through the warm, living air of the conservatory. It was the scent of a predator, calm and certain of its prey. The peace he had found here was a thin veneer of ice over a deep, dark ocean of fear, and it was beginning to crack. The ghost was no longer a memory. It was coming. It was almost here, and Elian was terrified that when it arrived, it would find him just as hollow as the day it had left him. The 17 minutes stretched into an eternity, and then snapped shut with the finality of a closing trap. The chime sounded again, this time a shorter, more percussive tone, indicating a presence at the door. Elian flinched as if struck. He hadn't moved from his spot, Kale's hands still a firm, grounding pressure on his shoulders. He felt frozen, a specimen pinned for observation. The air grew thin, each breath a conscious, painful effort. The rich scents of the conservatory, earth, jasmine, life, seemed to retreat, replaced by the phantom smell of antiseptic and cold metal. It was happening. It was real. Kale gave his shoulders a final, reassuring squeeze before letting go. He turned toward the entrance, his body language shifting. The quiet craftsman was gone, replaced by something harder, more resolute. He was positioning himself between Elian and the door, a silent, unmovable guardian. "Stay here," he said, the command soft but unbreakable. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, a sound that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. And there he was, Rhys Valerius. He looked exactly as Elian remembered, yet impossibly different. Taller, somehow. Broader. He filled the doorway, a figure of sharp lines and cool colors against the organic chaos of the workshop. He wore the severe, dark gray uniform of a high-tier administrator, devoid of any ornament. Yet it screamed authority more than any medal could. His hair was black, cut with military precision. His face was a study in controlled impassivity, the handsome features looking as if they were carved from marble. And his eyes. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept the room once, a quick, efficient scan, cataloguing the clutter of the workshop, the green intrusion of the conservatory, before they landed on Kyle. There was a flicker of something, annoyance, dismissal, before they moved past him and found Elian. Time stopped. In that single, locking gaze, 2 years vanished. Elian was back in the White Room, the verdict of compromised hanging in the air. Rhys's scent finally hit him. Not a phantom this time, but a real, physical presence. It was exactly as he remembered. Sharp, clean, and cold, like ozone after a lightning strike. It was an alpha's scent of command, of dominance, and it was designed to bring an Omega to heel. Elian's instincts, long dormant, screamed. A part of him, the conditioned part, wanted to lower his eyes, to make himself smaller, to submit. His knees felt weak. A tremor started in his hands and radiated through his entire body. "Elian," Rhys said. His voice was the same, a deep, resonant tone with no inflection, a voice used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. It was not a greeting. It was an activation command. Kyle stepped forward slightly, breaking Rhys's line of sight. "He is not here for you," Kyle stated, his voice steady, a rock against the tide of Rhys's presence. Rhys's gaze shifted to Kale, and this time the dismissal was overt. He looked at Kale as one might look at a piece of furniture that was in the way. "This is a matter concerning a designated bond, Beta. It does not concern you. Step aside." The casual venom in the word Beta was a physical thing. It was the core of their society's hierarchy. Alphas commanded, Omegas complied, Betas facilitated. They were the background, the support staff of the genetic drama. To Rhys, Kale was not a person. He was an obstacle, an irrelevant functionary. "His designation was severed," Kale said, his voice remaining level, refusing to be baited. "By you. He is a free citizen. You have no claim." A flicker of impatience crossed Rhys's face. The rejection was predicated on faulty data. A new analysis has been completed. The initial findings were in error. The authority has sanctioned this reclamation. He spoke in short, declarative sentences, as if reading from an official report. There was no emotion, only facts. His facts. The words slammed into Elian. Faulty data. In error. The entire foundation of his trauma, the reason for his exile, was being dismissed as a clerical mistake. The years of shame, of feeling defective and worthless, were being swept aside by a new calculation. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it was a slap in the face. It wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It was about data points on a screen. He was a variable in an equation that had been solved incorrectly, and now Reese was here to correct the formula. The shock was so profound it momentarily eclipsed the fear. A different emotion began to bubble up from the depths of his being, something hot and sharp. Anger. It was an unfamiliar feeling. In his old life, anger was a pathology, a symptom of instability in an Omega. It was conditioned out of him. But here, in the safety of Kale's world, it had been allowed to germinate. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing just behind Kale's shoulder. He could feel the protective warmth radiating from Kale's back. He met Reese's cold gaze, and for the first time in his life, he did not look away. "You don't get to do that," Elian said, his voice trembling but clear. "You don't get to break me, throw me away, and then come back 2 years later to reclaim me because your data changed." Reese's expression did not soften. It remained one of detached analysis. He was observing a new, unexpected variable. "Your emotional response is noted, but irrelevant. The bond is a matter of societal stability and genetic continuity. My lineage requires a compatible mate. The data now confirms you are that mate. Your personal feelings are a secondary consideration." The clinical cruelty of that statement was like a physical blow. A secondary consideration. He was not a person with feelings, with a life he had built from the ashes of the one Reese had burned down. He was a biological necessity, a vessel for a lineage. "No," Elian said, the word stronger this time. He took another step, standing beside Kale now, presenting a united front. He looked at the man who had haunted him, the man who was the source of all his pain, and he felt the fragile peace of the last 2 years solidifying into something hard and defiant. "I am not a secondary consideration. I am not your asset, and I am not yours." Reese's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He had expected compliance. He had expected a traumatized, broken Omega who would be grateful for the chance to be reinstated. He had not expected this. He had not expected Kale's quiet defiance. He had not expected Elian's strength. The situation was no longer a simple reclamation. It was becoming a negotiation. And Reese Valerius did not negotiate. He commanded. The Cold War had begun, and the first battle was being fought in the quiet, green sanctuary of a forgotten conservatory. The silence that descended after Elian's defiance was heavy, charged with the oppressive weight of Reese's displeasure. Reese did not rage. He did not raise his voice. His power was in his stillness, in the absolute certainty that the system was built to serve his will. He simply stood there, his presence a cold front moving through the warm, humid air, chilling everything it touched. The leaves of a nearby Mimosa pudica, a plant that curled its leaves at the slightest disturbance, began to fold inward, one by one. "Your living situation is irregular," Reese stated, his gaze flicking from Elian to Kale and back again. It was not a question. It was an indictment. "An Omega of your potential cohabitating with a Beta. It's genetically inefficient. The authority frowns on such anomalies." He was no longer speaking to Elian or Kale, but for the invisible record he assumed was always listening. He was framing the narrative, defining them as a malfunction. "We are not an anomaly," Kale said, his voice a low counterpoint to Reese's clipped tones. "We are two people living a quiet life, something the authority claims to value. Quiet lives are for those who fulfill their primary function," Reese retorted, his voice sharp with cold condescension. Your function, Beta, is to support the primary structures of our society, not to disrupt them by harboring compromised assets. The insult was deliberate, designed to remind Kale of his place, to isolate him. But the words didn't land as Reese intended. Instead of shrinking, Kyle seemed to settle more firmly into his own space. He crossed his arms over his chest, a simple, solid gesture of immovability. Elian is not an asset, he is a person, and this is his home. Reese ignored him, his full attention returning to Elian. It was a classic alpha tactic. Isolate the Omega, dismiss any other influence, and exert singular pressure. Elian, this arrangement, it is a temporary solution for your trauma, a coping mechanism. I understand. The rejection was difficult, but the error has been rectified. It is time to come home, to resume your purpose. Home. The word was a perversion. Home for Elian had been a series of sterile white rooms. Purpose had been a list of behavioral protocols. Reese was offering him a return to the cage, and he was calling it a sanctuary. The anger inside Elian, that nascent, unfamiliar heat, began to burn brighter. "This is my home," Elian said, his voice gaining strength. He gestured to the sprawling, chaotic life of the conservatory. "This is my purpose, learning to live. Something I never did with you." A flicker of something that might have been surprise crossed Reese's features. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his default mask of cool control. "You are confused. Your hormonal profile is likely unbalanced due to prolonged separation from a compatible alpha. The medics can correct that." He was pathologizing Elian's rebellion, turning his newfound strength into a symptom to be cured. He took a single step forward, a subtle invasion of their space. The air crackled. Elian instinctively took a step back, bumping into the solid presence of Kyle, who did not yield an inch. "Do not come any closer," Kyle warned, his voice dropping to a near growl. It was the most aggressive Elian had ever heard him, a deep, protective rumble that was startling in its intensity. Reese stopped. He looked at Kale, truly looked at him, and a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It was a terrible sight, devoid of all humor or warmth. "So that's it. You've imprinted on him. A beta. It's a biological impossibility, a pathetic mimicry of a true bond." He shook his head, a gesture of clinical pity. "He has damaged you more than I thought." The words were meant to wound Elian, to shame him, to make him feel like a corrupting influence. And they did. A hot flush of shame washed over him. Was that what he had done? Had he ruined Kyle's quiet, orderly life? Dragged him into this mess? He looked at Kale, his eyes wide with sudden doubt. Kyle did not look at him. His gaze remained locked on Reese, hard as flint. "What Elian and I have is not for you to analyze or label," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You deal in data, Valerius. You don't know the first thing about people. I know that our society functions because everyone understands and accepts their designation," Reese countered smoothly. "And his designation is with me. The authority has already opened a file. You will be contacted for a formal interview, Beta. I advise you to cooperate." With that, he turned his attention back to Elian, his expression softening into a calculated performance of concern. "Elian, I am not here to punish you. I am here to restore you, to restore us. Think about what I am offering. Your status, your security, a place in the world. Don't throw that away for this." He made a vague, dismissive gesture that encompassed the workshop, the conservatory, and Kale. Then, with the same silent, unnerving grace with which he had arrived, he turned and walked out. The door hissed shut behind him, and his presence was gone. But the cold remained, a toxic residue that clung to the air, smothering the scent of life. The moment the door closed, the strength that had been holding Elian upright dissolved. A violent tremor racked his body, and his legs gave out. Kale was there, catching him before he hit the floor, easing him down onto a low stool. Elian buried his face in his hands, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. The confrontation had drained him, leaving him hollow and terrified. "He's right," Elian whispered into his palms, the words choked and wet. "He'll use the authority. He'll take me. They'll say I'm unstable. They'll say you're a bad influence. They'll do something to you, Kale. Because of me." The shame was a thick, suffocating sludge in his throat. He was a contagion. He had brought the sterile sickness of his past into their sanctuary. Kale knelt in front of him, waiting patiently for the storm of tears to subside. When Elian finally lowered his hands, his face pale and tear-streaked, Kale reached out and gently took one of his trembling hands. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. "Yes," he said, his voice calm and solid. "He will try to use the authority. They will open a file. They will interview me. He is right about all of that." He paused, his thumb rubbing slow, soothing circles on the back of Elian's hand. "He is wrong about everything else." Elian looked at him, confusion warring with his despair. "What do you mean?" "He thinks this is about data and designations. He thinks he can win by quoting regulations," Kale explained, his grey eyes serious and direct. "He doesn't understand what has grown here. He can't measure it. And the authority, for all its power, has trouble with things it can't measure." He gave Elian's hand a gentle squeeze. "He thinks you are a broken object he can reclaim. But you are not broken, Elian. You have been healing. And I will not let him undo that." Kale's quiet certainty was an anchor in Elian's swirling vortex of fear. He looked around the conservatory, at the plants that had thrived under his care, at the half-finished timepieces on the workbench that waited for Kyle's patient hands. This was a world built on care, on patience, on mending. Reese's world was built on control, on power, on discarding anything that didn't fit. The contrast had never been so stark, so terrifyingly clear. Reese hadn't just come to reclaim him. He had come to erase this world, to erase the person Elian had become within it. The fight was no longer just for his freedom. It was for his very existence. The confrontation left a scar on the quiet atmosphere of the workshop, a lingering tension that even the scent of blooming moonflowers couldn't quite mask. Elian found himself jumping at small sounds, his sleep plagued by dreams of white rooms and cold, assessing eyes. The phantom scent of ozone returned, a ghost haunting the edges of his perception. He tried to lose himself in the routine of the conservatory, but his hands trembled as he pruned the delicate orchids, and he found himself staring into space for long stretches, Reese's words echoing in his mind. "Your personal feelings are a secondary consideration." He was an object, a beautiful, flawed, valuable object that had been misplaced and was now being sought by its owner. The 2 years of believing he was a person, a man with his own thoughts and his own worth, felt like a foolish dream from which he had been brutally awakened. Kale's reassurances were a comfort, but the fear was a deeper, older thing, a part of his conditioning. The system was absolute. Reese was an agent of that system. How could they possibly win? One afternoon, Cale received the official summons. It arrived not as a chiming message, but as a physical document delivered by a silent, uniformed courier. The parchment was thick and cold, the text printed in an austere, unforgiving font. Cale was to report to the Sector 7 Adjudication Center for a preliminary assessment regarding the status of the desynced Omega, designation E734. They had reverted him to a number. The casual dehumanization was breathtaking. Kyle read the document without expression, his face a calm mask. He folded it precisely and placed it on his workbench. "I have to go," he said, his voice even. "They'll question you," Elian said, his voice tight with anxiety. "They'll scan you. They'll look for what?" he said. "An improper imprinting." "Let them look," Kyle replied, turning to face him. He picked up a soft cloth and began to methodically wipe down his tools, a familiar, grounding ritual. "They will find a beta citizen who offered shelter to another citizen in distress. They will find a craftsman who values his privacy. They will not find what Reese wants them to find because it does not exist in a way their scanners can read." But Elian was not convinced. He knew how the system worked. It found what it wanted to find. Data could be interpreted, metrics could be skewed. A slightly elevated heart rate, a change in pheromonal output, anything could be twisted into evidence of instability or undue influence. "He will try to take you away from me, Cale," Elian whispered, the fear a raw ache in his chest. "He will say you are unfit." Kyle stopped his cleaning. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes holding a profound sadness, but also an unshakable resolve. "He is not the one who decides that." He put the cloth down and walked over to a locked cabinet in the corner of the workshop, a piece he rarely opened. He keyed in a code and the door slid open. Inside were not tools, but a series of old, leather-bound books and a single, ornate wooden box. He took out the box and brought it to the workbench. "My grandfather was a historian," Cale said, his voice taking on a softer, more reflective tone. "Before the restructuring, before history was streamlined into the official archives, he collected things, stories, truths that the authority found inefficient." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a timepiece, but a beautiful antique fountain pen and a small bottle of black ink. He believed that the most powerful act of defiance was to write your own story, to declare your own existence in a way the system could not easily erase or categorize. He took out the pen and offered it to Elian. It was cool and heavy in his hand. "Reese and the authority are writing a story about you," Kyle said. "They are writing about Asset E734, a compromised Omega, a malfunction. It is a story of data and control. It is a very powerful story, but it is not the only one." He gently closed Elian's fingers around the pen. "You need to write yours." The idea was terrifying. To put his own feelings, his own history, into words felt like the ultimate act of exposure. And yet, the weight of the pen in his hand was solid, real. It was a tool, a weapon of a different sort. Later that day, after Kyle had left for his assessment, Elian sat alone in the conservatory with a blank sheet of Cale's grandfather's heavy paper. The silence was absolute. He was alone with his ghosts. For hours, he just sat there, the pen clutched in his hand. He thought of the white rooms, the scent imprinting, the endless evaluations. He thought of Reese's cold hands, his dispassionate voice. He thought of the crushing shame of the rejection, The pain was a physical thing, a knot of ice in his stomach. Then he thought of Kale. He thought of the first cup of tea, the comfortable silences, the shared work, the gentle touch of his hand. He thought of the conservatory, of the feeling of cool soil on his fingertips, of the quiet satisfaction of seeing a new leaf unfurl. He thought of the man who had seen a person where the rest of the world saw a defect. He uncapped the pen. The ink was a deep, rich black. So, touched the nib to the paper, and the first word came. "My name is Elian." It was a simple statement, but it felt like a revolution. He wrote about the fear. He wrote about the pain. He did not write with anger or accusation, but with a quiet, devastating honesty. He described the feeling of being an object, of being erased. And then he wrote about Kyle. He wrote about the slow, patient process of being seen. He wrote about learning to breathe again. He wrote about the difference between a bond that was imposed and a connection that was built. He wrote until his fingers ached and the ink stained his skin. He was not writing for the authority. He was not writing for Reese. He was writing for himself. He was mapping the geography of his own soul, and in doing so, he was claiming it as his own. When Kale returned hours later, he found Elian asleep at the table, his head resting on his arms, the pages filled with his elegant script spread around him. Kyle looked tired, a new tension lining his eyes, but as he looked at the sleeping man and the pages he had filled, a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. He didn't wake him. He simply draped a light blanket over his shoulders and sat in the chair opposite, watching over him as the artificial night fell, a silent guardian in a war that was just beginning. The story was not yet finished, but the first and most important chapter had been written. The summons for the formal reclamation hearing arrived a week later. It was, Elian noted with a dark, bitter irony, addressed to Elian, resident at the domicile of Kyle, horologist. They had been forced to acknowledge his name. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The hearing was to be held in 3 days' time. It would not be a trial. It was described as an arbitration of biological imperative. The very language was designed to strip the humanity from the proceedings. Reese used the intervening time to apply pressure. Subtle, systemic pressure. Their nutrient deliveries became erratic, citing supply chain disruptions. The power to the conservatory flickered at odd hours, threatening the delicate climate controls. A sanitation drone was suddenly stationed just outside their door, its low, omnipresent hum a constant reminder of the system's surveillance. It was a war of attrition, designed to fray their nerves, to make their sanctuary feel like a prison. Elian felt the old anxieties begin to creep back in. He found himself checking the power conduits, rereading the nutrient manifests, his paranoia stoked by Reese's campaign. But Kale remained a steadying presence. For every problem Reese created, Kale found a quiet, practical solution. He rerouted power from his workshop's backup accumulators. He used his knowledge of pre-restructuring botany to mix supplements from the raw compounds he kept for his cleaning solutions. He calmly filed a formal complaint about the sanitation drone, citing noise ordinances. He met each of Reese's moves with a calm, logical counter-move, refusing to be rattled. "He wants us to panic," Kyle said one evening as he recalibrated the conservatory's humidity sensors. "He wants you to feel unsafe, to believe that only he can provide stability. Do not give him that." But the true revelation, the one that shifted the entire conflict, did not come from a summons or a systemic disruption. It came from a memory. Elian was trying to sleep, tossing and turning in the oppressive silence, when a fragment of the past floated to the surface of his mind. It was from the day of the rejection. He had been so consumed by his own shame and pain that he had blocked out the details. But now he remembered. The med tech in the room with them, the woman with the severe haircut and the cold, empty eyes. After Reese had declared him a compromised asset, she had looked at her data slate. She hadn't looked at Elian. She had looked at Reese, and she had said something. A single sentence, quiet and clinical. The Annex project directive is clear, Valerius. No recessive markers. The sample is unusable. The Annex project. Elian sat bolt upright in bed, his heart pounding. He had heard whispers of it. A top-secret, high-level eugenics program. It was designed to create the next generation of tier alphas, a purer, more powerful lineage to lead humanity. It was rumored to be Reese's personal project, the cornerstone of his career and his family's legacy. No recessive markers. Suddenly, it all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. His flaw, his latent volatility, it wasn't a flaw at all. It was a recessive gene, something in his phenotype that made him unsuitable for a breeding program. The rejection hadn't been personal. It wasn't that he had failed to be a good Omega for Reese. He had failed to be a good broodmare for the Annex project. The pain he had carried for 2 years, the deep personal shame of being unwanted, was a lie. He had not been rejected as a person. He had been disqualified as a specimen. He scrambled out of bed and rushed into the main room where Kyle was reading under a low light. He looked up, his expression concerned as he saw Elian's frantic state. "The Annex project," Elian breathed, the words tumbling out. "That's why he did it. The rejection. I had a recessive marker. I was unusable for his project." Kyle's face, usually so calm, hardened. He stood up slowly. He knew of the project, as most did, through rumor and encrypted reports. It was the dark heart of the authorities' obsession with genetic purity. "And now?" Kyle asked, his voice low. "Why does he want you back now?" The answer came to Elian with the same cold, brutal logic that governed Reese's world. "The project must have failed," Elian whispered, the pieces falling into place. "Or it's stalled. He needs something else. Maybe that recessive marker they discarded is now something they need. A new variable, a new path. He's not coming back for me. He's coming back for my genetics." The revelation was a profound, seismic shift. The shard of ice in his heart, the one that had been melting, shattered completely. But it was not replaced by warmth. It was replaced by a cold, hard rage. The humiliation he had felt was a carefully constructed illusion. His pain had been nothing more than collateral damage in a grand, arrogant experiment. He was not a failed partner. He was a discarded test tube that was suddenly needed again. He looked at Kyle, his eyes blazing with a fire Kyle had never seen before. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. All that was left was a diamond-hard certainty. "He didn't break my heart," Elian said, his voice shaking with the force of his fury. "He never even saw it. He saw a sample. He saw a collection of genetic traits. And that is all he will ever see." Kale watched him, a flicker of pride in his eyes. This was the turning point, the moment the victim became a survivor, the moment the prey found its teeth. "What do you want to do?" Kale asked softly. Elian looked towards the door, towards the city that Reese and his system had built. His expression was transformed. The soft, hesitant Omega was gone. In his place was someone steeled by a truth more painful and more liberating than he could have ever imagined. "I want to go to the hearing," Elian said, his voice cold and clear as a bell. "I want him to make his case. I want him to present his data." And then he met Kyle's gaze, a grim, determined smile touching his lips for the first time. "I'm going to show them what a recessive marker can do." The rage, once ignited, did not consume Elian. It clarified him. It burned away the last vestiges of fear and self-doubt, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated resolve. The 2 days leading up to the hearing were not spent in anxious waiting, but in quiet, focused preparation. It was not a legal strategy they were forming, but a personal one. They were fortifying their own reality against the one Reese would try to impose. They spoke more in those 2 days than they had in the previous 2 years. Elian, now unburdened by the shame of a personal rejection, found his voice. He told Kyle everything. He spoke of the cold, silent rooms of his upbringing, of the endless tests, the scent conditioning, the way he was taught that his only value lay in his compatibility with a predetermined alpha. He spoke of Reese, not as a monster, but as something far more terrifying. A perfect product of the system, a man so convinced of his own logic and purpose that he was incapable of seeing the humanity in others. He was a walking embodiment of the authorities' cold, eugenic dream. Kyle listened, his quiet presence a space for Elian's story to finally unfold. He didn't offer judgment or pity. He offered something far more valuable: validation. He would nod, his hand resting on Elian's arm, his touch a silent statement. "I hear you. I see you. Your experience is real." Their bond, forged in silence and gentle routine, was now tempered in the fire of this shared purpose. It deepened, shifting from a relationship of healer and patient to one of true partners. One evening, as they sat in the conservatory, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming cereus, Elian found himself looking at Kyle, truly seeing the strength he had so often taken for granted. "You never asked me why I came here," Elian said softly. "You just made space for me." Kyle looked up from the timepiece he was cleaning, a beautiful, old pocket watch with a mother-of-pearl face. "It wasn't my story to ask for," he replied simply. "I just wanted to make sure you were in a place where you could write the next chapter yourself, if you chose to." "I think I am," Elian said. He reached out and placed his hand over Kyle's on the workbench. Kyle's fingers, strong and calloused, curled around his. It was a familiar gesture, but tonight it felt different. It was not just comfort. It was an alliance, a promise. "I was so afraid of him," Elian confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm not anymore. I'm not afraid of him. I'm angry at the system that made him. The system that says a bond is about data and not about this." He squeezed Kyle's hand. "The system that says someone like you is secondary." Kyle's gaze softened. "The system is wrong about many things." A profound sense of peace settled over Elian. He knew the hearing would be an ordeal. He knew Reese would come armed with data, with legal precedents, with the full weight of the authority behind him. But it no longer mattered. Reese could try to claim his body, his genetics, his legal designation. But he could never again touch his soul. That now belonged to him. And his heart, which he had thought shattered beyond repair, was in the safekeeping of the quiet man sitting across from him. Their new strength was a quiet, internal thing, but it manifested in the world around them. Elian began to tend to the plants with a renewed purpose, his movements confident and sure. He no longer looked like a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He looked like a man who belonged. Kyle, in turn, seemed to stand taller. The perpetual weariness in his shoulders lessened. They were no longer just hiding. They were preparing to fight. On the morning of the hearing, they stood before the small, polished mirror in Kyle's living quarters. Elian was dressed in a simple, dark tunic, the kind of clothing Kyle wore. It was unassuming, comfortable, and utterly devoid of the soft, yielding fabrics Omegas were encouraged to wear. It was the clothing of a person, not a designation. Kale stood beside him, dressed in his own work clothes. They were not trying to impress the adjudicators. They were simply going as they were. Elian looked at their reflection. He saw two men, standing side by side, one quiet and steady as an old tree, the other slender, but with a new tensile strength in his posture. They were not a dynamic alpha-omega pair from the sanctioned stories. They were something else, something the system had no name for. "Ready?" Kyle asked, his voice soft. Elian met his own eyes in the mirror. For years, he had avoided his reflection, unable to stand the sight of the failure looking back at him. Now, he saw someone else. He saw a man who had been discarded and had found a way to grow in the cracks of a broken system. He saw a survivor. He turned to Kale, a small, genuine smile on his face. "Yes," he said, his voice firm and clear. "I'm ready." Together, they walked out of the workshop, leaving the warm green sanctuary behind. The sanitation drone hummed its monotonous, watchful tune as they passed. But for the first time, the sound did not inspire fear. It sounded like a challenge, and for the first time, Elian felt ready to meet it. They walked into the cold, grey light of the sector, two small figures against the monolithic architecture of the city. But they did not walk as victims. They walked as equals, partners, ready to tell their own story in a language the authority would be forced to understand. The adjudication center was a monument to sterile, impersonal power. It was a vast, cavernous hall of polished grey stone and cold blue light, designed to make any individual feel small and insignificant. There were no decorations, no art, only the stark geometry of authority. The air was chilled and smelled faintly of ozone and astringent cleaners. It was the architectural embodiment of Reese's soul. They were led by a silent functionary down a long corridor to a chamber designated Arbitration 3. The room was circular, with a raised dais at one end where three adjudicators sat, their faces obscured by the glare of the light panels above them. They were faceless, nameless arbiters of the system's logic. In the center of the room were two chairs, facing the dais. Reese was already there, standing beside one of the chairs, his posture a perfect model of respectful attention. He was dressed in a formal, high-collared tunic of the deepest black, a stark contrast to their simple, functional clothing. He looked like a predator in his element. His eyes, cold as glacial ice, met Elian's as they entered. There was a flicker of something in them, possessiveness, triumph. He believed the outcome of this hearing was a foregone conclusion. He gave Kale a dismissive glance before his gaze returned to Elian, a silent command for him to take the seat beside him, to assume his rightful place. Elian ignored him. He and Kyle walked to the two chairs and Kyle took the one beside Reese's designated spot. Elian, in a small but significant act of defiance, took the other, placing Kale between himself and his former alpha. Reese's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The battle had begun before a single word was spoken. "Let the record show," began the central adjudicator, their voice a synthesized, emotionless monotone, "that this is an arbitration hearing for Reclamation Protocol 7.3 concerning the Tier Alpha Reese Valerius and the desynced Omega, designation E734. "My name is Elian said, his voice clear and steady, ringing out in the oppressive silence. The adjudicator paused. There was a moment of electronic whirring. "The designation is E734. The chosen name, Elian, is noted as an informal identifier. Proceed, Valerius." Reese stood. He did not speak with passion or emotion. He spoke as if presenting a technical schematic. He laid out the facts with cold, irrefutable logic. He presented data slates that projected charts and genetic sequences into the air. He spoke of the initial rejection, framing it as a necessary precaution based on incomplete analytical models. He explained that new scientific breakthroughs had recontextualized Elian's anomalous genetic markers, revealing them not as a flaw, but as a unique and highly desirable trait for the continuation of a high-purity lineage. "The Anax Project," Reese stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "requires this specific combination of phenotypes for its next phase. The Omega's genetic profile is not merely compatible, it is optimal. It is, in fact, essential." He did not once refer to Elian by name. He was the Omega, the asset, the genetic profile. Elian listened, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, forcing himself to remain calm. He felt Kale's presence beside him, a warm, solid anchor in the cold, sterile room. "Furthermore," Reese continued, "the asset's current living situation is suboptimal. Prolonged cohabitation with a beta has been shown to cause hormonal imbalances and psychological instability in omegas of this grade. My reclamation is not merely a matter of genetic imperative, but a corrective and stabilizing measure for the well-being of the asset." He concluded his presentation and sat down, his face a mask of cool confidence. He had presented a flawless case based entirely on the system's own logic and values. He had proven, by their metrics, that his claim was not only justified, but necessary. The central adjudicator turned its attention to their side of the room. "Beta Kale, you are noted as the Omega's current custodian. Do you have a statement?" "Custodian." The word was another small, deliberate cut. Kale stood slowly. He did not look at the data projections still hanging in the air. He looked directly at the faceless adjudicators. "My name is Kale. I am a horologist. I am not his custodian," he said, his voice calm and even. "Elian is a free citizen who resides in my home as my guest and my friend." He paused. 2 years ago, this man," he gestured to Reese, "discarded Elian because he was deemed imperfect. He did so without emotion or regret. He did not offer him support or resources. He abandoned him. Elian came to me broken, so not by a genetic anomaly, but by a system that told him his only worth was in his biology. In my home he has healed. He has built a life. He has found a peace that your stabilizing measures know nothing about." He looked at Reese. "You speak of his well-being, but you are not interested in his well-being. You are interested in his genetic code. He is not a person to you. He is a key, a component you require for your project. That is not a bond. It is an acquisition." Kale sat down. His statement was simple, direct, and devoid of the technical jargon Reese had used. It was a statement of human truth in a room dedicated to inhuman logic. The adjudicators were silent for a moment. "Your emotional assessment is noted," the voice finally said. "However, this is a matter of biological law. Omega, designation E734. Do you have anything to add?" This was it. The moment. Elian felt a tremor of the old fear, but he pushed it down. He stood, his legs feeling surprisingly steady. He did not look at Reese. He did not look at the adjudicators. He looked at the empty space in the center of the room. "My name is Elian," he began again, his voice stronger this time, "and I am not a designation. I am not an asset. I am not a genetic profile." He took a deep breath. "For 2 years, I believed I was broken. I believed I was flawed, worthless, because the man I was assigned to, the system I was raised in, told me I was. The shame of that rejection nearly destroyed me." He turned his head and finally looked at Reese, his gaze direct and unflinching. "But I was wrong. I wasn't the one who was broken. The system is broken. A system that teaches people they are nothing more than a collection of genetic markers. A system that allows a person to be thrown away like faulty equipment because they don't fit a preconceived blueprint." He then turned his gaze to the adjudicators. "You speak of biological imperative. Let me speak of one. The imperative to heal. The imperative to grow. The imperative to choose who you share your life with." Reese Valerius speaks of a bond. A bond is not something that can be mandated by data or rescinded and reclaimed at will. A bond is built. It is built in shared silence, in quiet acts of kindness, in moments of mutual respect. It is built on seeing a person, not a purpose. He took a step forward, his voice ringing with a passion that silenced the entire room. "You want my genetics. You cannot have them. They are part of me, and I am not for sale. You want to reclaim me. You cannot reclaim something that was never yours. You did not want me. You wanted a set of ideal traits, and when I failed to provide them, you threw me away. Now your project requires a new set of traits, and you have come back. You are not a partner. You are a prospector, and you have found your claim to be worthless. And now you believe you have found gold in the same barren ground. But the ground is not barren. A life has grown there, a life you did not plant, and you have no right to harvest." He took a final breath, his heart pounding, his whole body alive with the truth he was speaking. "I reject your reclamation. I reject your labels. I reject your system's definition of my worth. My name is Elian, and I choose my own life. I choose a quiet life in a conservatory with a man who mends broken things. I choose him." He looked at Kale, and in that single look, he laid his entire soul bare. It was a declaration more powerful than any genetic bond. He stood there, his defiance a tangible force in the cold, sterile room. He had said everything. He had written his own story. The silence that followed was absolute, a stunned vacuum waiting for the system's verdict. The silence in the arbitration chamber stretched, thin and brittle. The 3 adjudicators were perfectly still, their faceless visages betraying nothing. Reese sat frozen, a statue of controlled fury. Elian's declaration hung in the air, a living, breathing thing in a room designed for data and death. He had not argued logistics or law. He had argued for the existence of his own soul. It was a language the system was not equipped to process. Finally, the central adjudicator spoke, its synthesized voice cutting through the tension. "The Omega's testimony is unorthodox. It is predicated on emotional and philosophical assertions rather than quantifiable data. A low hum emanated from the dais, the sound of immense processing power trying to reconcile two incompatible realities. The biological imperative and genetic value cited by Tier Alpha Valerius are significant. The law is clear on matters of lineage and societal contribution. However, the voice paused again. It was the hesitation of a machine encountering a paradox. The purpose of a designated bond is to ensure stability. The Omega's statement and the Beta's corroboration suggest that a forced reclamation would result in significant psychological distress. An unstable Omega is of no value to any lineage, regardless of genetic potential. Instability is inefficiency. The logic was cold, inhuman, but in its own twisted way. It was arriving at a conclusion that favored him. They were not validating his humanity, but they were acknowledging his defiance as a data point that complicated the equation. Therefore, the adjudicator concluded, a direct and immediate reclamation is deemed suboptimal. A period of observation and psychological reassessment is required. The Omega, Elian, will remain at his current residence under the custodianship of the Beta, Kyle. Tier Alpha Valerius will be granted structured, monitored, visitation rights for the purpose of re-acclimatization. A final determination will be made in 90 days. The verdict was not a victory. It was a stalemate, a stay of execution. Elian's heart sank. 90 days. 90 days of Reese being a sanctioned presence in their lives. 90 days of being a specimen under observation. It was a prison sentence served in his own home. Reese stood, his composure finally cracking, a muscle feathered in his jaw. Adjudicator. This is unacceptable. The genetic imperative is immediate. The project cannot be delayed by 90 days for the sake of an Omega's emotional whims. Your objection is noted, Valerius. The synthesized voice droned, utterly unmoved. The ruling is final. Inefficiency will not be tolerated, either in the form of a delayed project or a destabilized asset. This arbitration is concluded. The lights on the dais dimmed, and with that, they were dismissed. Reese turned, his eyes locking onto Elian with an intensity that was terrifying. The mask of calm control was gone, replaced by the cold fury of a thwarted predator. This changes nothing, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. You are mine. The data says so. The law says so. In 90 days, you will be mine. He gave Kyle a look of pure loathing. Enjoy your temporary custodian, Beta. He then turned on his heel and strode from the room, his rigid back radiating menace. Elian felt the adrenaline of the confrontation drain away, leaving him weak and trembling. He sank into his chair. 90 days, he whispered, the words tasting like ash. Kyle, what are we going to do? Kyle placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. His face was grim, but his eyes were clear. We are going to do what we have been doing, he said, his voice a firm anchor in Elian's despair. We are going to live. This is not a victory for him. It is a cage for all three of us. He thinks he can use this time to wear you down, to prove your instability. We will use this time to prove your strength. The journey back to the workshop was silent. The grey cityscape felt more oppressive than ever. The 90-day sentence loomed over them, a storm cloud on the horizon. When they stepped back into the conservatory, the warmth and the scent of life felt like a fragile dream. That night, Elian couldn't settle. He paced the conservatory, the adjudicator's words echoing in his mind. Monitored visitation rights. The thought of Reese walking through their sanctuary, his cold presence tainting everything, was unbearable. He felt trapped, his defiant speech in the chamber now feeling like a hollow, foolish gesture. He stopped in front of a night-blooming jasmine, its white flowers glowing like stars in the dim light. Its perfume was thick and sweet. He reached out and touched a delicate petal. This was his world. This was his peace. And it had been given a 90-day expiration date. A floorboard creaked behind him. It was Kale. He was holding 2 steaming mugs. He offered one to Elian. Chamomile tea, a simple, quiet offering of comfort. "He wants to prove I'm unstable," Elian said, staring at the flower. "He'll push me. He'll try to trigger me. He'll use every psychological tool the system taught him." "Yes, he will," Kale agreed, his voice soft beside him. "And if I break," Elian whispered, the fear raw. "If I have a panic attack, if I show any sign of the trauma he caused, they'll say he was right. They'll say I need his stabilizing influence. They'll give me to him." Kale was silent for a long moment. He took a sip of his tea. "Then you cannot break," he said, not as a command, but as a simple statement of fact. He turned to face Elian, his expression serious. "But you will not have to face him alone. When he comes, I will be here. When he speaks, I will be beside you. He is trying to isolate you again. We will not let him." Elian looked at Kale, at his calm, steady face, illuminated by the soft lights of the conservatory. He had stood for him, spoken for him, and now he was promising to be his shield for the next 90 days. The depth of his loyalty, his quiet, unwavering belief in him, was a force more powerful than all of Reese's data and all of the authorities' laws. A new resolve began to settle in Elian's heart. The 90 days were not a prison sentence. They were a crucible. Reese thought it was a test of Elian's stability, but he was wrong. It was a test of their bond. Elian reached out and placed his free hand on Kyle's arm. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Okay, we do this together." Kyle covered Elian's hand with his own. Together. Outside, the sector hummed its monotonous, controlled rhythm. But inside the small glass dome, a different kind of power was solidifying. It was not the power of law or genetics, but the quiet, resilient power of 2 people choosing each other, again and again, against the world. The 90-day war had begun, and in the heart of their sanctuary, the defenders were ready. The final resolution was unwritten, but for the first time, Elian felt a flicker of something he had long forgotten. A stubborn, defiant hope. The story was not over. He would not let it be.